And we have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hamay, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
And we have an unidentified flying object.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live, coming at you from the City of Angels, or not so angelic city, depending on who you speak to. I'm your host, of course, Dr. J, broadcasting, like I said, from the West Coast, where it happens to be a little after 7 p.m. Pacific Time p.m. on the Coast to Coast PM radio network, where our guest happens to be, which I'm going to give you subtle hints until you guys have had a chance to check it out on social media who it is. So that's the first clue. He happens to be in my time zone. So as you know, this is truly an international show. Right off the get-go, we have Johnny Webb in London, who's we're literally staying awake till 3 a.m. just to start the show, ending at 5. Poor guy. And then he still stays around to do some post-production work for the other networks. And as you know, we are syndicated on late night in the Midlands, as well as PSN Radio, and based in the UK, Deep Program Radio Network, and of course all the terrestrial stations in the Midwest and on the East Coast. So let's talk about our guest real quick. He is really, it's a small world. You know, just before the show, we're having a quick chat. Got some cool similarities on top of the topics we both like. We both went to the same school. Me for my undergrad, him for his graduate school. He also taught there. Fortunately, I wasn't there when he was teaching, which would have been really cool if I had that chance to actually see him there at the time. But he's still a professor. Here's another clue. At the University of Idaho. And on top of that, he also works with the National Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. There's another clue of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I will tell you the names of 2 of his books that really should give it all for you. And remind you, this is a guest that many of you have requested to have him back. And a lot of you said that this was the best guest of 2015 that I've had on this show, and that beat out Michael Dukakis, the former Defense Minister of Canada, Paul Hellyer, Congressman Cook, Senator Gravel, all those people in between. Yes, that's right. It happens to be the one and the only Dr. Richard Spence. Dr. Spence, welcome back, my friend.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dr. J. And you set the bar kind of high, so
it's the truth.
I'm gonna have to say something, huh?
It's the absolute truth. Well, I omitted the names of the books because I figured that was just going to blow the secret, so I decided to spill out your name first. So let me go ahead and spill out the 2 books for you, for everybody. Of course, what I have in my hand. And here's the ironic part. As a host, I get, maybe 1 to 2 dozen books sent to me a week. Well, I happen to go buy this particular book about 2 years ago, 18 months ago, maybe somewhere in that range. Secret Agent 666. What happens after I read it? I get it in the mail from one of the publishers. I'm like, no way. You guys booked this guy. I want him. And that's how I found you. I thought that was pretty cool. But, of course, you also have a book on Sidney Riley. And with between those 2, that essentially covers both of the world wars, right?
Well, they contain. I mean, the action in both of them is more concentrated around the First World War. Riley's, out of the picture before the second one rolls.
That's right. That's right.
But Crowley's still kicking.
Yes.
All the way up until 1947.
That's right. That's right. Just 2 years after.
I could add a couple of other books in there. Can I do that?
Sure.
Can I shamelessly promote something?
Of course.
All right. The first, not that anybody will ever want to read it or be able to buy it because it's long out of print and horribly expensive. But actually, the book that sort of got me started on this is a book called Boris Savinkov, Renegade on the Left. And if people have heard of the Russian Revolution, I suppose they had, and you've heard of Lenin and Trotsky, and maybe you heard of Kerensky, you probably haven't heard of Boris Savinkov. But he turns out, and that's why I was interested in him, because he's one of those people who's like a jack-in-the-box popping up in all of the key events, but nobody ever talked about him. So I decided that, well, I have to plunge into that. But it's the work on Savinkov that introduced me to Riley, and then it was Riley that sort of, in its own way, sort of led to Crowley. So I sort of credit that. The other book, which is the Savinkov book, was written back in 1991. Maybe the most recent thing that I've done, I think about 2011, I co-authored with a fellow by the name of Walter Bosley. And it's called Empire of the Wheel, which is a kind of historical true crime book with certain occult overtones. So anybody who's interested in creepy things that were happening in Southern California, and aren't they always, around the time again of the First World War, which I seem to be stuck in, they might want to look that up as well.
And they definitely will. And everybody, remember, all you have to do is go to drjradiolive.com. Remember, that is the only thing you need to remember when it comes to this show. That is the name of every single social media account you could think of. But back to the site. Click on the Books and Videos tab. Scroll down to Richard Spence. Click on his name, and it'll take you to his author's page on Amazon. So it's simple. You could find all his books right there. And, of course, in the bio of Richard Spence, you'll find all his other information as well as your website, right?
Yeah, it's just the university website, but that's got all the pertinent information on it.
That's right.
It certainly should have, right.
Now, before we go into the spies, which, by the way, I love spies so much. You've seen the movie Breach, and I know you know about Robert Hansen, right?
Right.
I went out and sought Eric. Yeah, that's right. Eric O'Neill, to get him on the show to talk to us about Robert Hansen. But that's just how much I love spies. So before we do that, I want to talk about something that you told me last week. Something I know everybody just we get this straight, so we don't get a lot of questions flooding in. We're going to talk about spies. This is a professor here, and he's not a UFO guy, but he did stumble on something that was intriguing enough to I figured. Let's find out. So let's take us back to 99 years ago. What did you... Well, you didn't find it 99 years ago. You found something from 99 years ago. And what was that?
Well, it sort of connects with spies because what I was looking for, what I found was what today would almost certainly be called a kind of UFO flap. All right? But we're going back to 1917 and 1918, and the term unidentified flying object didn't exist. In fact, none of the terms that we would, currently associate with aerial phenomena were around at the time. The interesting thing is that some sort of aerial phenomena was going on. Now, I go back to something you mentioned. Again, as a disclaimer, I am not a UFO guy. I'm not opposed to them. I don't debunk them. I have to say, I've never seen one. I know people who say that they have, and I believe they saw something, but I'm not coming at this from really a standpoint of any kind of personal experience. It's not something that would ordinarily attract my attention. What I was going through is that there is a searchable online database which contains old files of what was then called the Bureau of Investigation. Later became the FBI, but that doesn't happen for a while. So this is pre-J. Edgar Hoover.
Pre-J. Edgar, exactly.
Yeah, this is the very early stages of the Justice Department's investigative branch. Well, those are all declassified and available, and they've been digitized, and so you can go through, and the search engine isn't particularly good. Sometimes I've looked for things, and then I've found them, it didn't come up. But what I was looking for, which is another story entirely, was I was looking for the term airship. I was searching for anytime that showed up. And what that brought me to was a file, and a lot of these files are titles. Some of them have the title of the person, if they're an investigative file on a person or an event. But this one just said, as many of them do, various. All right? Mm-hmm. Now, that tells you absolutely nothing about what the content, nothing of what's in there. So I thought, well, okay, airship's in here somewhere, and I began looking at it, and I realized that this was a file that was pretty big. It had almost 400 pages in it. Now remember, these files can have anywhere from one page, they can have hundreds of pages, but this one was on the fairly large side. So I began reading, and the way these things are arranged, I began reading from the end of the file back to the beginning, which is always kind of an interesting experience. But what it was is that it laid out this whole story. that dealt with, you have to go back to Salt Lake City, Utah, in the summer of 1917. Now, to give a little historical background on this, in the summer of 1917, the United States had just recently entered World War I. That, again, is something sometimes people forget. The United States didn't enter the First World War really towards the end of it. So it was in April 1917 that the U.S. joined the war. So we're now talking about events that begin in July and August. So things are just beginning to gear up.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the things that gripped the country once it entered the war was a spy mania. And there was great fear of, that the Kaiser's spies were everywhere and that there was and there was some justification for that, because there had been, when the U.S. was a neutral country, there had been a number of high-profile acts of sabotage. There was indeed a kind of secret war going on between Allied and German secret agents, and sabotage was a part of that. So it wasn't imaginary that there were German spies. It was just now that there was, with the country at war, there was the idea that these spies would come out of the woodwork and everything was going to start blowing up around you. Well, that didn't quite happen, but that's part of the nervousness that exists. So keep in mind, anything strange that happened, any kind of out-of-the-ordinary experience, was likely to be chalked up to the nefarious plottings of Kaiser Wilhelm and his spies.
Yes.
So that's where spies sort of work into this story. Now, the central character in it was an agent of the Bureau of Investigation, an attorney who'd gone to work for the Justice Department, a guy with he has a great name for this, Leon Bone. Not Leon Redbone, Leon Bone. And Leon Bone was the sort of, BI agent in Salt Lake City, and there hadn't been a lot going on there. He was experienced, both as an attorney and investigator. There were later accusations against him that he was a complete incompetent, but if you go back and look at his career, he seems to have been reasonably competent in what he was doing. So what began to occur that summer in 1917 in the Salt Lake City papers and in other papers in Ogden and Logan and other places, there were these reports of lights in the sky all across the state. From northern to southern Utah, people were reporting seeing weird lights at night. And, by lights, I mean not just sort of glowing orbs, but things like spotlights that shine down on the ground that was apparently coming from some sort of craft. And sometimes people heard nothing, and sometimes they heard kind of a low hum or the sound of engines. But, these reports were coming in fairly consistently. And this was the type of thing. Now, again, in 1917, aircraft exist, and people were aware of them. I mean, there were airplanes. There were both, Zeppelins, and there were airplanes, but they weren't common, and
right.
Particularly they weren't.
A decade and a half, or maybe not even not even close to 2 full decades of after the Wright brothers, right?
No, I mean this is barely a decade after that. So aviation is in its infancy. And, you had maybe an airfield. There was an airfield, a military airfield, Salt Lake City near Fort Douglas. But, in rural areas, I mean, there's a lot of flat places to land. Yeah. These just weren't common. Airplanes weren't a common sight, especially in what was then, which is still a pretty remote area of the country, but then was even less populated and more remote. So there were reports that appeared in the papers, and Bone sort of took it upon himself as a good Fed to sort of try to look at what was going on, because if these involved airships could involve Germans, and who knows, somebody could drop a bomb in Salt Lake City. So maybe I should try to figure out whether this is just a bunch of hysterical people, who are seeing things, or whether there's actually some substance to it. Well, what that eventually led him to, again, through a newspaper article, because in one of these articles, a couple of local men, a couple of Salt Lake City men came forward and said, "Oh, yeah, we're the ones who are behind the lights." Okay, and it's this new invention that we're coming up with. It's this fabulous new, world's never seen it kind of flying machine, and we're not going to reveal it yet. Well, he thought he should look into it. And that led him to the center of this group, a guy by the name of John Van Valkenburg. So John Van Valkenburg proves to be, eventually he's the kind of centerpiece of this whole thing. Everything ultimately revolves around Van Valkenburg, because is it turns out in the end, not to give too much away, he's the only person who really says he has seen and operated this fantastic flying machine. Yet he is able to convince, and in time he is able to convince Agent Bone that this machine actually exists. Now that to me was one of the most interesting part about this, because there are a whole number of levels to this, and one of the levels is that you have this kind of collective delusion of people who absolutely believe in something that they haven't seen, that they actually have no evidence that this exists, but they are absolutely certain that it does, and in some way, Valkenburg seems to have been the man who convinced them. So what was he? What sort of powers did he have? Well, he and a lot of the other people who were involved in this, in fact, the three principals, Van Valkenburg and his friends Ed Althoff and Charles Henderson, one of the things they had in common is that they were all Masons. Now, by that I mean that they were tilers and they were stonemasons.
Okay, got you.
But they're also Freemasons.
Freemasons. That's what I was assuming.
Yes. So now you've got this whole thing of you have Masonic Masons, which I guess must have existed somewhere, but why you find three of them together, I don't know.
Yeah.
But there's nothing exceptional about these guys. I mean, Van Valkenburg's background, he and his father had sort of run a shipping, what we call a shipping and moving company. They were grain merchants for a while. Althoff and Henderson had dabbled in mining and prospecting, and they were sort of self-taught engineers, and they knew stoneworking. So there's nothing in the way of a technical background about any of them. So if you're going to figure that you're going to have three guys who somehow would come up with the most fantastic aerial machine that anybody had ever seen, certainly by 1917, you wouldn't have picked them. They seemed not to have any particular training. Now, their explanation for this was that, no, we don't have any training, because we had all of this sort of handed to us on a platter, and it was handed to us on a platter by this kind of magical being which they variously described as the adept, or the old man, or the superior power, or the one above. But they had all these different names for him. Eventually, it turns out he has a very human name, but that's the way that they described him, and that this kind of superior power, this great adept, had contacted first Valkenburg, and then had him select certain men, sort of find his apostles to follow him, and he revealed to them this power that they had. So what was the power that they had? Well, they claimed to have created an airship that was unlike anything that existed at the time. Now remember, you had sort of two types of aerial travel. You either had big bags of gas that floated around, the dirigible, the Zeppelin, or you had these small baling wire and cloth and wooden frame, generally biplane aircraft with a small engine that powered them. And also keep in this time, you don't have pressurized cockpits. The operative ceiling for an aircraft, was maybe about 15,000 feet. But remember, the pilots going above 12,000 feet, you begin to get oxygen sickness, and so you can't stay up very long. But also very short duration, and I might add, incredibly unsafe. Now, what they claimed about their craft is that it could fly up to 1,000 miles an hour. In fact, they weren't really sure how fast it went, because that's as fast. They could go from Salt Lake City to San Francisco. They timed it in 47 minutes. And they could
wouldn't be possible with any aircraft that were at the time.
No, certainly no airplane had the range, and none of them, 100 miles an hour
max
would have been
about
max that you're going to get out of this.
Yeah.
So they claimed they had something that could go 1,000 miles an hour. It could go to San Francisco in 47 minutes, and it could ascend up to 40,000 feet or even more almost instantaneously. And they said, well, we have these special masks that the adepts told us how to make, and they're sort of like firemen's oxygen masks. But then, and so that they could do that. And then we also can go, and we've flown north for huge distances, and we have like a little small ship that only one guy is in. We call that the tube, and we have other ones that a bunch of people can go in, and we can ascend up, and we can go up through the atmosphere through any kind of weather. It doesn't matter. No storms will bother us because these craft are always self-leveling. They are not affected by any kind of weather. And so what powers them? How do they do this? Do they have propellers? No. What powers them, they said, was a little device about the size of a man's hand, which seems to have contained what they called rotating discs. I think in one reference they say that there were discs that counter-rotated. And it's, their statements are sort of picked up here and there, and it's never been completely clear to me whether the rotating discs and the controller, the thing they talked about that made all of this work, the thing the size of a man's hand, are identical or whether they were two separate pieces. But now that might sound familiar to some people, because the idea of rotating discs, rapidly rotating discs or counter-rotating discs, there have been various experiments done, the whole idea that this can somehow lessen gravity. And this is what they claim this did, is that the controller, and somehow working with these discs, negated gravity, and negated it totally so that they could just ascend as quickly, and they were stable, and they could stop on a dime, and they could go up and down like an elevator if they wanted to, and they could fly any distances, east or west, north or south. So keep in mind, what they're talking about is something that is absolutely beyond any frame of reference for 1917 aeronautics. But it does have certain echoes. I mean, again, I'm not a UFO guy, but I knew that I'd sort of come across, rotating discs. Well, the first thing you think of rotating discs, you think of, woo-woo flying saucers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So that sounded kind of familiar, the idea that rapidly rotating discs. So where would they get this idea from, and where would they get it in 1917? Now, that part of the story is fantastic enough. They didn't stop there. Now, Van Valkenburg took this much further. Van Valkenburg claimed that not only had he done things like fly all the way to Washington, D.C., and I think at one point he claimed that he flew all the way over to the battlefields in Europe. He could fly all around. I mean, the flight to San Francisco was nothing. But he said, I once flew straight north for 32,000 miles. Now, that gets a little mind-boggling because the Earth isn't that far around. So where and he goes, and I flew north for 32,000 miles, and I ended up in this completely different land, inhabited by a superior race with, get this, big heads.
Very similar to what you hear now.
Yeah, so I don't know. He didn't say they were gray or anything, but there's a superior race, and they have large heads, and they live in this land. He goes, if you basically go high enough, he would even argue in the atmosphere, you enter an area where it's perfectly still and where you can breathe, and it's just like being on the surface of the Earth. Now, science wasn't what it was, then what it was now, but people still knew what the circumference of the Earth was, and they still, knew that the atmosphere eventually just, frittered away until there was nothing and you were in a void. So it's hard to tell what it was that they were describing. And that's the ship itself was kind of fantastic, but then this whole, the stories of going for 32,000 miles. So, other things sort of come up. Was he talking about hollow Earth?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that was actually on my mind.
That's the only thing that I can. That term never comes up in it, but he goes, I headed up towards the North Pole, and I just kept going and going and going, and 32,000 miles later, I'm in this wonderful land where it's spring-like and everything. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's where it came from. When he's talking about ascending up to where the adept lives, if the descriptions of that, if you put it together, to me sound like what he's talking about is that the adept lives in some kind of large craft mothership, which is in a static orbit, which is in a synchronous orbit with the Earth. Now, again, nobody used those terms.
I know, and this is stuff that you hear today.
That's the stuff you hear today, and what I would have to think is that, well, since they wouldn't have those terminologies, how would they describe it? And if you take what it is that they're describing, it fits. Now, true, what I'm doing here is that I'm trying to figure out that they are talking about something, and if they're talking about something, that's what it could be. There's another possibility of this, is that Valkenburg was simply making up a completely wild story, but he was making up a pretty original story. And the other thing is that even as he admitted is that, if I wanted to come up with a story that I could just con people with, well, I wouldn't include these things, because he would later be told, as the investigation went on, well, that what you're talking about is physical. I mean, what you're talking about, it defies the laws of physics and of science. It can't happen. So, you've got to be either lying or you're crazy. And he would insist that I'm not lying and I'm not crazy. And I'm just saying that that's what these things are. And if I wanted to tell a story that would be more believable, I could tell a story that would be more believable. But that's what this one would be. Well, this is what Bone sort of gets drawn into this whole thing. Remember, he starts out as an outside federal investigator, Bureau of Investigation agent, who's, sniffing around for what he thinks might be possibly German spies. And he stumbles across Van Valkenburg and his friends, and he eventually comes to realize it's not just the three of them, that there are 9 principals, and that they're recruiting other people. Because as it eventually turns out, this adept, this superior being that they're supposedly taking orders from, has a larger plan in mind. His plan is the creation of a human utopia on Earth.
Really?
A reign of universal brotherhood. And the way he's going to do this is by using these sort of selected apostles to recruit others. So the whole idea is that I recruit you, you recruit 3 others, each of them recruit 3 more, and on and on and on. And that eventually we will have this whole cadre of a kind of new priesthood that will be able to lead the world into this. But you have to pick these people very carefully. And the idea was that that's why I'm giving you this technology so that you will be able to demonstrate this, but he also sort of would tell them that you have to be very careful who you bring in, and you don't want this stuff to get into the hands of people who might use it for, I don't know, there's a war going on, right? Remember, the whole world's at war.
World War I, yeah.
So remember, the idea that, if we could get a hold of aircraft that could go 1,000 miles an hour, I mean, we could just, we could bomb everything.
That's right.
So that seems to have been. So one of the things that eventually emerged is that they claim to be working on the device and perfecting it, but they never show it to anybody. I mean, Bone, eventually is initiated into the group. He wins their confidence, and they initiate him into their secret society, but he still never sees it. They keep saying, well, we have to wait, and the adept isn't sure that the time is right for this, but when the time is right, people from Washington come out and will show it to him. It's only much later, towards the end of it, that either he uses as an excuse or as as an answer that he believes. Is that Valkenburg says that, well, the reason we never revealed this is because the adept thought that it would be used for bad purposes. So we have to hold that back. So the time goes on. Remember, we started out in the summer of 1917, and this goes on through the end of the year. So now we're sort of approaching, the end of 1917, beginning of 1918. Nobody has, and by the way, Bone has dutifully written to the chief of the Bureau of Investigation in Washington, a guy by the name of A. Bruce Belaski. And he's sending these reports to Belaski, and and Belaski, of course, is kind of interested, and what he's saying is that, well, get these guys in, talk to them, make them show you something, and when they've got something that when there's actually something to see, let me know. We'll send people out to look it over, and of course, take it. Because the government obviously should control this.
Yes.
And and as time goes on and nothing emerges, you have other people, other federal employees, the local, attorney general, friends, there have been people who knew and respected Bone, but by the end of the year, they've come to believe that he's lost his objectivity, and that he's now become a true believer in some sort of strange cult, and they just don't think that he can handle this, right? So eventually, at the beginning of 1918, some months later, they bring in another guy from Los Angeles, by the way, from the BI office there. They bring in a guy named Robert Whitson. And Robert Whitson is a very different, he's a different breed of cat in this case. Whitson is absolutely convinced from the get-go that there's some sort of enemy action going on here, that one way or the other, German spies are involved in this. Maybe they're just doing it to demoralize the public, or maybe they're trying to frighten people. But nevertheless, he comes in and he's going to get to the bottom of it. Now, the interesting thing is that his superiors in Washington and his fellow Fed buddies in Salt Lake City don't tell Bone that another investigator has been brought in to take over the investigation he's supposed to be running. So Bone is still, what he later argues is that he's trying to ingratiate himself with these people, as he later said, so he could figure out what they're doing, and he thought the way to do that was not to threaten them, but to, sort of humor them to some degree. And he thought there was something going on, but he thought that was the way that he would eventually get the truth out of them. Well, Whitson isn't going to take that role. Whitson comes in, and he starts surveilling everybody. He puts double 24-hour surveillance on Valkenburg and all the other principals, and he's got gumshoes running all over the place, and he begins trailing them. And that's, that brings another level to this. They begin to find out that he begins to discover that, no, there's not 3 guys, there's not 9. I think eventually he identifies something like 22 or 24 individuals that he thinks are mixed up with this. And he also finds out that they have this special place where they have meetings. And it's a little town way out in southwestern Utah, a place called Milford. Pretty much just a kind of rail siding. It was a little bigger town than that, but a small town, really in the middle of nowhere. The only thing of significance near it is Roosevelt Hot Springs. Mm-hmm. So if anybody's ever been to that area of Utah and you go to Roosevelt Hot Springs, this apparently was somehow the center of this, what, for other lack of a better term, was a kind of early 20th century UFO cult. But he was never able to figure out what it was they did there. I mean, they would go, and it was all, and it would keep broadening, and more people would be brought into it, but it was still difficult to tell what was going on. So eventually, again, the weeks go on, and we come to March 1918. At this point, Whitson just gets fed up, and he arrests the principals. He drags...
Really?
He pulls them in. And he pulls in Van Valkenburg, and he pulls in Althoff and Henderson and other ones, and these men are now questioned. And he has to think of charges, and so the charges he thinks he can get those 3 on is impersonating a federal agent.
Huh.
Now, the reason that he thinks he can get them on this is that all 3 of them possess and have shown to people a letter which says that local officials, sheriffs, police, whatever, other federal officials are supposed to render them assistance because they are engaged in special work for the government. Well, the thing is, they didn't write these themselves. It turns out that Agent Bone gave them the letters.
Yeah, so they can't have that charge, brought against them.
Really, they couldn't. I mean, there was a question as to whether or not, now it gets into these, the legalese things, did Bone have the authority to essentially federally deputize them? Well, they didn't think so, but they weren't absolutely sure. But Whitson didn't care. Whitson was going to go ahead and prosecute him for him anyway, because it gave him a reason to bring him in and to question him. And so now he gets Van Valkenburg, and he questions him, and he brings up all the evidence that, the story you're telling is ridiculous, this again defies the law of physics, this is absurd, what's the actual truth in it? And Van Valkenburg, who, as far as I could tell, could easily have gotten himself out of any trouble he was in by simply saying, okay, I made it all up, it was just a story, sticks to the story. They have one of his fellows, I think it's Althoff, who's brought in, and he's claiming that, yes, I saw the ship fly on this night, and I was there. And they go, well, you couldn't have been, because we had 2 people watching you all night, and they filed reports, and according to them, you never left your house. And he goes, well, I don't care what the report said. I went out and I saw the ship fly. And they go, that's impossible, because they watch you all the time. And he goes, well, I don't know. And you get other people answering that, well, it's both. They get these Zen-like answers, like, well, it happened and it didn't happen.
Wow.
And it's in the process of this questioning that eventually, now, Agent Whitson figures out that the only guy he can determine who can definitively say that he's met the adept and actually flown in this is Van Valkenburg. And all the rest of them just seem to take this on some sort of weird faith that he has. But Whitson eventually writes back to Bruce Pulaski in Washington in frustration and goes, look, he admits he hasn't been able to turn up a shred of evidence that there's any kind of German agents involved in it, but he still can't dismiss the possibility that, evil forces in Berlin are somehow behind this. And mostly, it's pretty apparent from his reports, he's just frustrated, and he thinks that these guys are doing something, and he's going to figure out what it is. So he decides that he's going to have Van Valkenburg and I think Althoff and Henderson evaluated by what they then called alienists.
Really?
Which today we know as shrinks.
Yes, I was just going to say, yes, the psych ward shrinks.
Yes, but he brings in the alienists. He brings in the psychiatrists.
And what a term, too, for the time, alienists, right?
So they interview them, and they come to the interesting argument is that, well, these men all seem to be perfectly sane except about this airship, and in that, obviously they're insane. Therefore, they're suffering from some kind of peculiar selective insanity. So perfectly normal otherwise, but
with
crazy
regards to that.
But without they're crazy. There's to show you how desperate Whitson was. One of the things that his investigators can remember that they're following Van Valkenburg and people constantly, and when you follow people constantly, sometimes you run across things.
Yes.
And one of the things they ran across was that Van Valkenburg, who was a married man, was carrying on with a woman who was not his wife.
Oh.
So they catch him in an extramarital affair, and because of that. Whitson's trying to figure out ways that he can, try him for, adultery isn't a federal offense, but, if somehow he could get her to take this woman, over to Nevada, he could get him on the Mann Act and he could, we wanted something that he could hold him on and threaten him with to get him to tell the truth. Well, never really get anything substantial out of them. They just give their Zen-like answers and stick to the story no matter how absurd. And so the alienists have decided that they're selectively crazy. So I think beginning with Althoff and then eventually with Van Valkenburg, they drop the charges of which actually have gone to court. There's a whole courtroom they're trying to...
Really?
And he sort of realizes that there's no real evidence against them, and so they send them to they're sentenced to the state mental institution in Provo.
Asylum.
Asylum. So they're sent to the asylum, I think, in May. All right. Now, for indefinite observation. Well, the story might be that, well, I guess these guys are going to disappear into the bowels of the Utah insane asylum, but in fact, in a month they're out. They're released.
Observations show that they're normal, right?
Apparently the alienists re-examined them and decided that they were okay. And that is where the whole thing just comes to a screeching halt. I mean, they're released. They go back to the lives they were leading before. Most of them live, Althoff, one of the key figures. A lot of them, interesting enough, end up in Los Angeles. But he eventually, I think, dies in the 1960s, in El Dorado, California. I sort of traced him down there. Van Valkenburg and his family, continued to live in Salt Lake City. And you just never hear about him again. I mean, they seem to go back to living the sort of normal, uneventful lives they did before, and nobody ever mentions the airship or the adept, none of this.
That's so bizarre. And I'm trying to put myself in that year, right? Just imagining the scenery, the lack of population, there sure as heck wasn't 7 billion people on this planet back then, especially on the west coast of the United States, or these regions, like you're saying, that are very, weren't populated at that time. And just the mannerisms, and I could just... it just boggles my mind what these agents were probably thinking, as they're observing these people. And, looking at it in hindsight from 2016, you could say, well, maybe there's some alien abduction involved, or, maybe they stumbled on LSD before Timothy Leary. I don't know, but that is one heck of a story, that I gotta say.
It's one of those things that just sort of there's no real resolution to it. I mean, what it's never said. What I'm guessing in this case is that at some point they either just said they didn't remember it, or they just decided that having put them in the loony bin and for a while then let them go. But it's never pursued from that point on. There is, Whitson might have, in his investigation, he might have stumbled across something in this. He was trying to figure out where Van Valkenburg could have come up with elements for this story. And it turns out that around the same period, I think back around 1915, 1916, there was a writer, apparently one time a very popular writer, who I'd never heard of, a guy named Arthur Train, who wrote a couple of books, and one was called The Man That Rocked the World, and the other one was The Moon Maker. So, Man That Rocked the World, see if any of this sounds familiar to you. There is an eccentric genius, sort of Superman, who goes by the pseudonym of Pax, who has invented a miraculous flying machine called the Flying Ring, and has all kinds of wonder weapons and can cause earthquakes around the world, and he's basically threatening the world, and unless it abandons its evil ways and embraces peace and brotherhood, that he will destroy it. Okay, yeah. I mean, partly it's kind of a rip-off of Robar the Conqueror of Jules Verne,
or several other stories,
and several other ones. But that book apparently achieved a certain degree of popularity, and Whitson found a copy of that, I think, in Vaulting's home. And he assumed, well, Vaulting, maybe that's where he got the whole idea about this. Oh, one little thing I didn't add, all the other marvelous things that the Adept and their machines supposedly could do, it had a death ray. You knew that had to be
the famous death ray.
There had to be a death ray. They could melt entire mountains if they wanted to. So we add the death ray in. Now, the death ray, that was one of those things. And again, about the same period, I think in 1915, Nikola Tesla had claimed that he could create a death ray.
That's right.
That could annihilate entire. Now, that again is in the newspaper. So if you begin to look at that, it's possible that Valkenburg, who was, for all of his sort of modest beginnings, seems to have been, reasonably self-educated and fairly well-read, that he could have read, about Tesla's death ray in the paper. He could have read Train's book about the man who rocked the world. Oh, and there's another book that came out, I think, in 1914, Edgar Rice Burroughs' At the Earth's Core.
Real quick on this topic, Dan's got a question. SoCal Dan, welcome on.
Hey, Dr. J. Richard, I was just going to ask you, how was the contemporary Nikola Tesla possibly involved, and maybe even his mentor Edison. These were both in conjunction with working in conjunction with the Army at the time.
Yeah, it's if you want to, all kinds of, this thing opens it up to all sorts of some sane and some much more speculative ideas. And when they say, well, I don't know, maybe the Adept was Tesla. Okay, maybe that's. He did work for a while in Colorado, so he wasn't unacquainted with the West. So was that it? Was this some sort of weird incarnation of Nikola Tesla, and he was using these guys? That's I think extraordinarily unlikely. But it's the question. Leon Bone, in one of his last letters in this case, in sort of summing up why he was criticized because you let these guys take you in and you lost your objectivity, and you were no longer looking at it like a real investigator. He goes, look, the stories these guys would tell were completely fantastic, but they were so fantastic. They were so beyond anything that someone who was simply trying to con them. And by the way, one of the things these guys never really tried to do was to exploit it to get money. They did on occasion would ask people for relatively small amounts of money, but when they were told no, as they were in almost every case, they never insisted on it. So if they were using this as a con, they didn't make any money off of it. There wasn't any kind of sort of operation that they were doing. They just seemed to have been convinced in this. Maybe Valkenburg simply told a tall tale that got taller and taller and taller, and he couldn't figure out a way to get out of it. But he could have saved himself certainly a lot of trouble if he'd simply admitted that's what it was, and he didn't do it. There's also the idea that someone who read a draft of the article I wrote on it said, well, maybe what happened here is that there was something. Maybe it's not what they described, but there is some sort of device, and the government eventually got their hands on it, and that's why everything goes dark.
Stopped. Yeah. Dark projects, black ops projects. This is, long before the CIA, long before, we were doing any of that stuff. At least I would think. But then again, you have Abraham Lincoln warning us of corporations in the 1860s, and then in 61, we have, of course, Eisenhower warning us of the military-industrial complex, right? But this is 1918, so again, so just so much to think about. It just again boggles my mind. All of it. It's really an intriguing tale. I really wish I had some sort of time machine that I could just go and observe, and just kind of go back before the Bureau of Investigation even got involved, and sort of see if, when did this adept character emerge in von Valkenburg's life, and when did these changes start happening? When did he start recruiting these others? That's what I'd ideally like to do, but this is past, and we're in the future, we're in the present, the future for them, but nonetheless, and that is outstanding.
One of the things that goes on in this all through this period is that the lights in the sky keep appearing.
Really?
So, yes, that's what it doesn't really stop. They continue to show up, and there are even reports of them into early 1918. These lights would show up. They'd be reported around Moab, or they'd be reported here. And sometimes you would, it's like modern UFO sightings. Sometimes there would be one person, sometimes there'd be several people, a dozen people would all say that, yes, we saw this, and the light was white, or it was yellow, and it moved, and you get these ideas that sometimes they move very rapidly around the sky. They don't all seem to be describing the same thing. Often it's like there's something in the air, and it's training a powerful searchlight on the ground. In other cases, it appeared to be more like lights that warrant more of what we think of as sort of the standard UFO, or simply kind of dancing around in the air. So that's one of the things again that Bowen said. He goes, look, there are too many of these reports to simply be people making them up. So there are these lights. So the question is, if these lights aren't connected to these guys and their supposed invention, then what are they? And that, again, is one of those things which is never answered. So in the beginning, there are the lights. Then there's Van Valkenburg and his friends who emerge with an explanation of what they are, and then that fades into nothing, and the lights are still there.
Now we're gonna come up to a break in about a little under 10 minutes, but I was hoping we can at least get started. Now, this is a complete shift, but
right.
This is relative to the time period. Now, aside from talking about Sidney Riley and Aleister Crowley, this actually is about Aleister Crowley. Let's go back to 1904, Cairo. The book of the law that was allegedly dictated to Aleister Crowley by the being, whatever his name was, that today...
Aiwass,
that's right, with the cape and the large head, very similar to what, these gentlemen were describing as the adept, or specifically von Valkenburg. But nonetheless, that's essentially what led now to the OTO and all these other people believing Aleister Crowley was the so-called prophet. But what was Aleister Crowley's change from 1904 leading up to the war in the occult world that would get him to be in such positions where he's rubbing shoulders with these people that are deeply involved, especially during World War II, such as Rudolf Hess and everybody else in the top echelon of the Nazi party that were occultists?
Well, it sort of goes back to his German connection. And the German connection is, the key figure that sort of introduces Aleister Crowley into the world of German occultism. There had to be one of those.
Yes.
Is a guy by the name of Theodor Reuss, Reuss, Theodor Reuss. And Royce is one of the, now, you mentioned an organization there, the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis.
Yes.
Okay, today that it exists in, there are various, I guess we could say, sects or divisions of the OTO. The main one is the Caliphate OTO, which is centered in the United States. I think also has the UK under its umbrella as well. But there are other, it's one of those things that you have to dance around some kind of sectarian disputes as to which is the true root of it. But let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning, the OTO has nothing to do with Aleister Crowley. It pre-existed before so he joins an organization which is already there, and it is a German organization. I think it's actually formed by a guy by the name of Karl Kellner, and Royce comes in fairly early, and its form comes together between about 1900 and 1905 in Vienna. So, the OTO begins as a German organization which intended to be a kind of master lodge. I mean, there are various grandiose plans. It was going to reconcile all different forms of Freemasonry, and it was going, it was going to make sort of like Rosicrucianism and Martinism and Freemasonry and everything else you could imagine into a giant occult soup, and it would be the center of it. Never quite materialized into that. I mean, despite their efforts, it remained, from its formation, a relatively small and obscure organization. Now, Royce also had another day job besides being a German occultist. He spent much of those years before the First World War, in fact, right up to the outbreak of the war, he is in England. He's in London. And he works in various jobs. He worked as a newspaper, as a journalist. He had other jobs. But what he really was a German spy.
Ah, yes.
Theodore Royce had come as a German political agent into England, and he was recruiting a small, he was a controller, so he was recruiting other sort of agents around him. That's why when war was declared, he got out as quickly as he could. Because if he had stayed there, he would have been interned, and even sort of worse things might have happened to him. What did he do when he went back to Germany at the beginning of the war? He went to work for German intelligence. So Royce during the war is in Switzerland and on the Dutch border as a German military intelligence. That's what he was before. So that's what the OTO is, and that's who Royce is. And in my suspicion, okay, those are the sort of basic facts. Now, what do you do with those? My suspicion is that what Royce did is that I think Royce had legitimate spiritual and occult interests, those two things, just being different words for the same thing. I mean, he was legitimately interested in these things, but also he could recognize that one of the things about, let's say, a secret society, a secret lodge of any kind, is that these are organizations that transcend borders. They're like corporations that can operate all around the world in different countries. And even with less visibility. So, if people ever wonder why would anybody in an intelligence organization be interested in some sort of an occult secret society? Well, one, people in those societies generally know a very important thing, how to keep their mouth shut, because they're based around secrecy. They are also highly selective in terms of who they recruit, and most importantly, they're largely invisible to the world around them. Nobody who isn't initiated into them really pays much attention to them or thinks much about them. So I think it's in 1910 that Crowley, who has steadily sort of increased his prominence in the British occult world, is initiated into the OTO by Theodore Royce. Now, that is one of those things that is how Crowley becomes connected to the OTO. It's the basis for which, and Royce actually they would give him these sort of grand titles, and he goes, well, you're now going to be the head of the OTO for the British Isles, and by extension, North America, because, they're all sort of English-speaking there as well. So you're going to be kind of the grand poobah, that wasn't the exact term, but for those territories. Now, keep in mind, Royce was initiating him into an organization that, really didn't have much of any kind of actual presence in there, but it was as a title. But he was also doing something else, I think. I mean, that's the visible thing. The other thing that I think Royce was doing is that by initiating Crowley into the OTO, he was at least toying, if not actually doing, the process of recruiting him into German intelligence.
Thank you. See, you're way ahead of me
There
on
you
that.
go.
That's exactly what I was just going to ask you. Was he, testing to see if he could withstand being an intelligence agent and possibly even being a double agent for them? Or triple, that would be even worse.
He would be, Crowley was, had proved himself to be. Remember, Crowley. Everybody today tends to think of him as this kind of, fat, bald guy.
Yeah, that's right.
But something, if you go back into this period, into the period prior to the First World War, he was a large, physically powerful man. He was very athletic. He was a world-class mountain climber. A lot of people forget that. He was one of the first people to attempt K2. I mean, he was the guy, one of these guys who would go out and climb Everest, and he was very good at it. And that was one of those things that demands a great deal of, physical toughness. And so anybody who tends to think of Aleister Crowley as being, this kind of little small, dumpy, fat guy who looks like Buddha, that didn't come along until much, much later in years of abuse. Early on in his youth and even in well into his adulthood, he was very athletic. So he's physically capable. He's experienced. Crowley had traveled all over the world. And one of the things that Royce probably knew is that Crowley at least had dabbled in doing intelligence work for the British. But he also realized that Crowley is a man sort of, let's say, who doesn't fit in well with ordinary society. Right? He's a rebel. He's kind of an outcast, and he's becoming increasingly an outcast. Now, think of the way in which Crowley can play that up. I hate, British bourgeois society, and I can't stand. I mean, it would be easy for him to go in and portray himself as an embittered, disillusioned Brit.
Yes.
Now, that combined with his experience and resourcefulness is someone that if you were a German agent recruiter, this is a man who might be useful. So rather than, recruit him into Abteilung 3B or something of that kind, what we do is that we use the OTO as a cutout organization, an organization that can be used to recruit agents, a medium through which they can even report to me, but which from the outside all appears to be just a bunch of weirdos doing weird things, and no one's going to think anything about it. Now, the reason I strongly suspect that is that to me explains why. Remember, his initiation happened in 1910, before the war breaks out. When the war breaks out, Royce, hot-foots it back to Germany and becomes openly an intelligence operative. And then Aleister Crowley on Halloween of 1914 shows up in New York. And very quickly and successfully insinuates himself into the German underground operation in the city. I mean, they eventually even bring him into meetings of the propaganda cabinet, which is where they sit around and even talk about things like blowing up Allied munitions.
Really?
Now, the question is, why on earth? I mean, if you think about in terms of basic operational security, one of the things that you wouldn't do, you've got some guy who is a British subject, a rather eccentric character, hops off the boat in New York, claims to be an Irish nationalist, although the slightest investigation would reveal that, one, he's never set foot in Ireland, he's not Irish, and he has no association with this previously. So why would we believe that kind of cover story? So why would they take him into their... Why would one of the prime German agents in the U.S. at that time, a German-American writer and publicist, a fellow by the name of George Sylvester Viereck. Now, you may have some listeners that may have run across that name because George Sylvester Viereck is a pro-German operative in both world wars. In the 30s, he becomes, his allegiance goes to Hitler, and he's in fact arrested during World War II and charged with being an unregistered enemy agent. But in the First World War, Viereck manages to skate around any kind of legal complications, but it's Viereck who recruits Crowley to write for his magazine, to write anti-British propaganda for the Fatherland, the magazine he runs, and it's Viereck who knows the German military and naval attachés and is acquainted with the whole sort of underground sabotage propaganda apparatus that brings Crowley in. So why would these people possibly accept him? Are they going to accept him on Virek's word? No. There had to be some... I mean, you know, Crowley would later argue is that, well, I was able to fool the Germans because, in his argument, you know, Germans are just naturally gullible, all right? I don't think that quite explains it. He was, you know, clearly getting around the fact that there was something he could play a card. What was the card that Crowley could play? Who could he get to vouch for him that this guy, despite everything that might be suspicious about him, is okay? That guy was Theodore Royce.
Now,
and
go on, continue that story. I want to finish it real quick. I was going to say we should be taking a break, but we also have a question that's originating from across the pond. But I want you to be able to finish the story, and then of course we're going to pick it up when we come back. But we also have the, somebody in the UK that Johnny's got a question waiting for you, and I don't know if we're moved past that, but nonetheless, please finish that, and then I'll get to that before we get to break.
Well, we could, a break would be. I mean, the thing is that it's almost there had to be some reason. The Germans, Virek and others, not being total idiots. They're not that. As to why they would have had anything to do with Crowley at all, and that had to be because he could present some bona fides. He could have someone vouch for him. And the only person who had a connection to Crowley previously, who also had a connection to German intelligence, who could say that, yes, I initiated this guy into the OTO, I recruited him in 1910, you can trust him, is Royce. And that, I think, is the connection between Crowley's initiation into the OTO, which was both, part of his occult operations, but then also was a critical factor in his infiltrating the German operation in New York during World War I.
Real quick, and before I bring this over to the Atlantic Pond, this is just a yes or no question pertaining to the story of 1917, 1918. This is from Lou Sheehan, Rancho Cucamonga. He asks, can Richard post the link to the 400-page report discussed?
I think I can. The place you can find it is that there's an online database called Fold3, Fold3. And if you go there and you look for FBI records, you search for the term airship, or you search for von Valkenburg, you should come up with that. And one of the things I can do is I can send you. It's actually in the article I sent you. Better than that, I can give you the file number. That's the way that you would find it. You would go to Fold3 and you would simply put in the number, and that will take you there.
That's something we'll definitely put when this is archived in the description. Now, before we take the break, let's go to the Atlantic, across the Atlantic Pond. Johnny Webb, what do you got?
Good evening, Dr. J, and good evening, Dr. Richard, to you too. This comes from Colton on Facebook in Solihull in England. He says, you mentioned secret orders, secret societies, but what does Dr. Richard think of the Rosie-Cranston monument in the Georgia Guidestones, supposedly commissioned by a pseudo name R.C. Cranston? Is there a secret message that he can decipher or understand from that?
The Georgia Guidestones, I wish I could give you a better answer. I look at them and I don't see anything terribly mysterious. I mean, I think, somebody went to a lot of time and money to put them there, but I'm not sure that I see any more than somebody's sort of giant vanity project. There could be more.
Like the Coral Castle in Florida, sort of.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I don't see that there has to be any more to it than that, which doesn't say there isn't.
It's true. That's true, and that's what leaves the question open. Now, with that being said, now we'll officially take our break. Everybody stand by. We got so much more with Richard Spence when we come back on the second hour of Dr. J Radio Live.
This is George Tsoukalos, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
These creatures are very, very strange. They're anomalous.
It is the age of revelations. Bizarre creatures. The false perception of reality exposed.
Just go to the Dr. J's, website. You'll see it on the left-hand side. It's like right there. Click the link. Guys, what can I tell you? I mean, it's $40, but you get a DVD and a book plus three bonuses. Communion CD, a year subscription to our Politics, Prophecy, and Supernatural magazine, which comes in your email box. Watchers 3, which is $20 for that DVD. Fingerprints of the Supernatural. We promise you, you will not be disappointed. And Dr. J gets a cut of the proceeds, so everybody's happy. You support him, you support us, and it's all good. And you get to educate yourself on what's going on, because we've just scratched the surface here. Trust me.
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
Torpedo impact now, 40 seconds. Torpedo impact, 25 seconds.
All ahead flank. All ahead flank. I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
All right, welcome back to the second hour of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I am your host, Dr. J, and where we are broadcasting from the City of Angels, where we are now 10 past 8 p.m., where of course, my co-host is located all the way across the Atlantic Pond, across the U.S., literally 8 hours away from me. 8 hours in the future, for that matter. 4 a.m. in the next morning. Nonetheless, Johnny Webb is out there, of course, watching out for all your social media questions. And, of course, we also have Dan here monitoring the chat rooms. And, of course, Tom. Taking care of all the cool scenery that you guys will be checking out later, and doing sound engineering while we're on, as well as the website. Now, of course, we've been talking with Dr. Richard Spence. He is an awesome author, a really cool guest, and according to all you listeners, and I'm talking about tens of thousands that I've received over of messages that at least I've read, comments from going back from 2015, was that he was the number one guest from that year. So, backed by popular demand, here he is. Now, real quick, before we resume, we already have another question lined up from a listener. Before we resume what we were talking about with, of course, Aleister Crowley being initiated into the OTO by Royce, who happened to be a Berlin intelligence agent, and that, of course, would lead to Richard Spence's book, Secret Agent 666. But real quick, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Richard Spence himself to talk about his books and where to get them, aside from our website, and anything else that Dr. Spence would like to say. Dr. Spence, what would you like to tell everybody?
Well, I guess we mentioned the books at the top of the hour. We can mention them again. My books. First book was Boris Savinkov, Renegade on the Left. That was published through an academic press, which means it's no longer available. And but you can find, if you're interested in Boris Savinkov, if anybody knows who he is, who was a much more important figure than other books might reveal. You could hopefully find that somewhere. The two that are readily available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are merchandised, certainly is Secret Agent 666. That is readily available. My book on Sidney Riley, Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, is just gone out of print, but I think that there are probably some certainly copies that could be picked up there. And the Empire of the Wheel, the book that I co-authored with Walter Bosley, that is an ebook that is available on Amazon as well. If I can plug something I'm working on now, which hopefully, I'm knocking on wood here, will be out next year, is that I'm working on a book called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. And if that sounds familiar to some people, there is at least in some circles, a relatively well-known book written in the 1970s by Anthony Sutton called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And I want to make it very clear that my book is not a refutation of Sutton, whose work I greatly admire and got me interested in it, but it is an expansion of that. I'm sort of taking his basic idea, and this looks at the connection primarily between American, but not just American, political and economic interests and the revolutionary movement in Russia, all the way from the beginning of the 20th century, really up to 1917 and beyond, into the early 1920s. So the establishment of the Soviet regime, and then really the consolidation of the Soviet regime, and how primarily American interests sort of played with that, and in fact, in some ways, has facilitated it.
Now, I really look forward to that, and I really hope you do get the book on, of course, Sidney Riley, which is Trust No One, back in print, because a lot of people will enjoy it, as we do have the cover of it available, of course, on our website. Now, before we go back to World War I and then World War II, I know this show is going to run over, and we're going to have to do another one, literally, probably one for each book, and then continue to do them, because you're such a popular guest, and we always have fun with you. Let me read you this question, then we got another one, and then we're going to go back to that. Here, this is pertaining to now. This is Kim Walters, Lansing, Michigan, spying, I'm just reading this. If so, how and why is Putin trying to influence the election? For example, the hacked Democratic Party emails.
Well, somebody's trying to influence the election. I'd have to say I'm not convinced that this is basically what we know. Somebody hacked the DNC email. Somebody hacked a bunch of George Soros's emails. There's somebody out there hacking emails right and left. The one lesson from that: don't put anything important in email,
or anywhere, really, for that.
Or
matter.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean that should probably be the one thing that people should learn from that, and they haven't. That's the one thing that you know. These hacks have taken place. Now, who's doing the hacks? Now, that's the question. I think it's kind of, considering the tensions around that the Russians are doing, and they could be. I don't think that that's impossible. But the point is, if you look very closely, you don't really see any proof of that. There are people who argue, particularly when I read something like experts think this is what it is. Well, I don't know who those experts are. I don't know what their expertise is, and they don't know that. They are doing the same thing that I would be doing, that they're speculating. Their speculation may entirely be right. I mean, this is one of the things. We have to speculate or we get nowhere, all right? No human progress has taken place without, just saying that, I think probably the world is round. Let's find out, all right? But you don't know that until you actually try. But I think it's a kind of easy soundbite to argue that, well, clearly it's Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. But, to me, that smacks a little bit of the whole idea that if there are lights in the sky in Utah in 1917, that Kaiser Bill must be behind it. And I don't think there's really any hard evidence either way. The important thing to note is that all of these caches of emails are tremendously vulnerable, that they are breaking into them on a regular basis, and if I had any kind of trove of that material with anything valuable in it, I would get it off the web or anywhere electronically accessible as quickly as possible. That's the lesson to be learned there.
Okay, now we have a couple more questions coming in, and then, of course, we're going to pick up on Crowley and World War I and World War II, and, of course, Sidney Riley. Now, let's go back to the United Kingdom. Johnny.
Hi there, this comes from Jeremy in Bournemouth, England, and he asks, can you... Sorry, I lost the page there. Can you... Sorry, first... God, I lost the page. Give me 2 secs, Dr. J. Sorry, okay, guys.
We'll go to SoCal Dan.
All right, Richard, I was wondering, with Aleister Crowley's penchant for hanging around very, very rich people, it seems that the royals, being involved in all these mystical subjects, would also welcome him very easily into the royal houses.
Well, probably only through the back door. I'm not sure that he was. The thing that we may have discussed before is that Crowley was someone who I think rather liked for a long time having an outrageous reputation.
Yeah, and being the outcast.
And being the outcast and capitalizing on that. The thing about him, though, is that at heart, and there are even sort of statements you can find him making where I think he really sort of yearns. The real heart of Aleister Crowley was what was really a kind of chauvinistic, in many ways, bourgeois Englishman, who was in some ways quite proud of that. I mean, he was really quite proud of his nationality, and he was proud of being English, but he wasn't proud of it in a way that I think I may have told this story before, but it's a good one. He was supposedly asked once early in the First World War, why would a man like you possibly be interested in serving his country, serving the cause of Britain? And Crowley responded, and I'm paraphrasing this, he goes, look, I don't think for a minute that the English pot is any less black than the German kettle. In other words, I don't, my loyalty isn't based upon something in the moral superiority of British life or manners. He goes, my loyalty is the loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. He's making an Oliver Twist reference there. My master may starve me and he may beat me, but he is my master and I love him. And what he was, I think, saying in that case is that I have all kinds of I may be an outcast, I may be despised, I may despise things about British society, but nevertheless that's what I am, and that's why I would serve it in a war, not because I'm thinking some glorious tribe, but because I'm basically serving the interests of my people and my tribe, and that I think was to me, I don't know about to others, struck me as a kind of insight into what actually made this guy tick, as to why he would do that thing. I think in that statement he was telling a fundamental truth that he didn't tell elsewhere.
Yeah, let me go back and check with Johnny in London. Did you able to find that?
Yeah, okay, this comes from Jeremy in Bournemouth on Facebook again. Is Snowden really dead after releasing DNC docs of Hillary? Another one to the list of mystery deaths related to it.
Is Edward Snowden on the... didn't Snowden just recently use Mark Twain's statement that the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated? I'm not going to believe he's dead until I, see
a funeral with his family and
see a funeral at the Kremlin and see him buried in the Kremlin wall. Yeah. No, Edward Snowden is still, very much alive. I think that he's probably more likely to stay that way if he stays in Moscow than going where else.
And I can attest to this because we're in negotiations to get him on the show. So, obviously, if he would be dead, his attorney would tell us.
That would be a great disappointment.
Yeah. Anyhow, now back to World War II or World War I. So, obviously, like you mentioned, that Crowley didn't have any allegiance in particular to, as far as morality, to Germany or to the United Kingdom. And he was a world traveler, as you mentioned. Now, so we see why Royce could have been vetting him to become an intelligent agent. And then you talked about how he was in New York. Was it, what year was it, 1914?
1914, Halloween 1914 is when he arrived.
Halloween, that's right, and was literally...
It has to be Halloween.
Within, I know, right? Within, the grasp of the top echelon of the Germans, at the time, the propagandists, as you were mentioning. Now, was that all because of what Royce did?
Well, there may be other facts. I mean, I'm trying to look, I'm trying to connect the dots where I can see them. And in looking, I come back to this question. It was a question I was asked writing the book, and I've asked myself since. I mean, why, again, whatever their limitations otherwise, the men he was dealing with, the Germans in America, were not fools. And they, most of them, by the way, were diplomats or others. They weren't, one of them, Hugo Munsterberg, was in fact a university professor, which means, he didn't know what he was doing. But nevertheless, the most simplest thing is that if you're running a secret organization, you just don't pick up people off the streets, especially when you know that they come from a belligerent country. And I could never fathom as to why the Germans would take seriously his claims to, suddenly become an ardent Irish nationalist. I mean, the Irish didn't credit him with that. I mean, there were plenty of, it wasn't the IRA then, but there were plenty of Fenians in New York at the time, and none of them seem to have taken him seriously at all. In fact, he never even tries to penetrate their organizations. He is focused from the beginning in trying to inveigle his way into the confidence of German agents in New York. And to do that, he needed someone who could vouch for him. And there may well have been other people that he encountered. I mean, there's another, remember I said that I think Royce was important to vouch for him. Now that raises an interesting question, is, well, why would they pay any attention to Royce? I think the reason for that is that Royce was an experienced and trusted agent who had long worked for Germany in England. He was assumed to know something about that country and the characteristics. Was that enough? Another point, remember I said that the fellow who actually brings Crowley in, the first person that he in some ways sort of seduces, is George Sylvester Viereck. I have entertained the possibility, and I think that one would have to, entertain the possibility. Let's put it this way. If I was a German intelligence officer and I was trying to figure out how was it, knowing later what happened, that Crowley managed to infiltrate our organization, well, Royce might be to blame, but then my other attention would come down to Viereck. And one of the things that I would wonder there is whether or not Crowley turned Viereck.
Interesting. That's really an interesting thought. I have a question here. Now, this is really jumping literally through World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the outbreak of World War II, and literally to the Fuhrer. Okay, Larry, this is for you out there for asking this. Larry Seller in Stanton, Pennsylvania. It's pretty much a really easy question that he wrote. Did Crowley interact with Adolf Hitler?
Okay, there are lots of claims that they met, that Crowley sent him his book. You even see that, Adolf Hitler's whole philosophy is based upon, the Book of the Law. As far as I've been able to determine, Aleister Crowley never got within spitting distance of Adolf Hitler. That is, now, again, that's not to say that it didn't absolutely happen, because we can't account for, but there's, the closest there were, through people like Royce, Crowley had good connections with the German occult underground or occult society. And one of them was a woman whose name is now going to elude me, but she becomes quite she becomes very enamored of Hitler. She believes that he's her magical child, and he's what's been predicted, and she's the one who tries to put the Book of the Law in Hitler's hands. She does not succeed.
Oh.
There may have been others who did that. That I think there is a confusion. I think where part of this comes in is that Crowley, in some way, and this is one of the things that happens in history, you'll sometimes find, is that one person sort of rolls into another one. So if you begin to look in the sort of early, if you look at the period of the rise of the Nazi Party, I mean, keep in mind Hitler's political career in the German Workers' Party, or later the German National Socialist Workers' Party, begins in 1919, when, by the way, he's sent in by his army superiors to spy on them. Okay? I think, by the way, that that's a very important thing to remember about the beginnings of Hitler, is that he is sent to spy on the nascent Nazi Party to check out what was going on. Now, and then ends up joining it and taking over the operation. Now, that's a story in and of itself. Is that entirely accidental? But basically, nothing much really happens with the Nazi Party. I mean, if you look at German electorate, until the Depression rolls along. So in 1928, they're a minor party. 1930, suddenly they're a big party. And for people looking for an explanation, well, it's the economy.
That's right.
You had the Depression, you had millions of unemployed, people were dissatisfied with the existing parties, and Hitler appeared on the scene as an alternative, and that's where the votes come from. Now, living in Berlin in that period, in and out of Berlin in 28, 30, and 31, even into early 32, he sort of goes in and out, but Crowley actually spends most of his time in the German capital at the very time in which Hitler is rising first to national and international prominence. Now, I think certainly, considering everything Crowley was, he was observant, he read papers, he knew what was going on around him, he had to be interested in that. And he may well have been reporting on what it was that he saw. So were lots of other people. But during the same period that Crowley's living in Berlin and Adolf Hitler is rising to national and international prominence, there's another guy who actually was probably getting more headlines in Berlin than Hitler was in this period, a fellow by the name of Hanussen.
I thought you were going to say Hindenburg, but no, I've never heard that one.
No, Hanussen. You have, this is Eric Jan Hanussen, Hanussen. And Eric Jan Hanussen, even though he may not be nearly very well known today, Hanussen was a big deal in Berlin. He was probably the most popular stage act in the city. And so what was Hanussen? He was a mind reader. He was a psychic. He was an astrologer. He was a magician. I mean, he basically played around with all the things that Crowley did, but he did it for entertainment in a kind of, almost...
a Houdini way.
Houdini, okay. But Houdini with sort of, I don't know, if Harry Houdini and Aleister Crowley had a baby, which I don't want to think about, it might be Hanussen. But Hanussen was a big deal. I mean, he had like 2 newspapers going, and his shows would be sold out. And one of the reasons he was a big deal is that he was a stage psychic and medium, but he had actually at one point, as early as 1928, gone on trial in Czechoslovakia for being a fraud, and guess what? He was vindicated. The court could not prove he was a fraud.
Really?
And therefore he could argue that, you see, I actually do have these powers. Now, the whole thing about Hanussen is that you can debate back and forth to this day as to whether or not Hanussen actually possessed any real powers or whether he was a very clever con man. That's kind of irrelevant to the overall question that he was very well known, and in Hanussen's case, there is a direct connection to Hitler.
Interesting.
Because what Hanussen began to do, remember he has 2 sort of tabloids coming out.
Yeah.
He does mind reading, but he also makes predictions. He's a prophet, And one of the things that he predicts is that Hitler in early 32 had lost his bid to become German president. He was defeated by Hindenburg, and he was kind of down in the dumps. But Hanussen argued, well, in the next Reichstag elections, the Nazis are going to emerge as the biggest party. And guess what? They did. Now, the other thing about Hanussen is that he was a stage performer, and he had a whole repertoire of elaborate, practiced sort of gestures that he used. And he becomes close friends with the head of the brown shirts in Berlin, a fellow by the name of Count Helldorf, becomes his friend. In fact, Helldorf eventually even makes Hanussen an honorary member of the brown shirts. And so Hanussen, beginning in this period, sort of tilts more and more. He begins to make these pro-Nazi predictions, and through Helldorf, he is introduced to Hitler, and I think has at least 2 recorded meetings with him. Now, there's a whole mythology around this, and one is that it's Hanussen who taught Hitler the arts of public speaking. So if you see Hitler making his dramatic gestures, the argument is he learned those from Hanussen. That doesn't quite add up, because Hitler actually knew a lot about public speaking as far back as 1919. And, it doesn't say that Hanussen might not have taught him something, but it wasn't as if Hitler was a complete amateur by the time Hanussen comes along. Hanussen, on the other hand, would make these predictions, and another prediction he makes is that Hitler, what did Hitler want to become if he couldn't be president? Chancellor. And indeed, Hitler becomes chancellor. And then, after Hitler becomes chancellor, Hanussen, who's, we're like riding at the top of his power and influence in this place, makes another prediction that he sees a great German building consumed by flames. Now, guess what happens that same evening or the next evening? The Reichstag burns.
Ah, yes, and wasn't that blamed on...
It was blamed on the communists. It's generally accepted that the Nazis set the whole thing up. They got a patsy that they could parade, and Hannesen had clearly. I mean, everybody thought that's what he predicted. He didn't say the Reichstag, but he predicts a great German building is going to burn, and the Reichstag catches on fire. You figured that's what it was that he was talking about. Now, you assume that would make him even more popular. Within 2 weeks, at the outside of that prediction, Hannesen is dead, and later his decomposing body is found beside a road outside Berlin, riddled with bullets. Now, the assumption to this day is that Hannesen got, too big for his britches. And if you go on this, if you go by this kind of logic, the Nazis burned the Reichstag, which of course they blamed on someone else. Hannesen, if he didn't have psychic powers, then must have been in on it. And therefore, he sort of let the cat out of the bag. And that was a kind of a stupid thing for him to say at the time. And so, since he might say other stupid things, we need to get rid of him. Oh, there's one more thing about Erich Jan Hannesen I didn't mention. He's Jewish.
Go figure, and that's what was blamed, right?
Yeah, although the interesting thing is...
the breaking of the glasses or something... wasn't there a night like that?
That's the Night of Broken Glass. That's in 38.
Okay, God, literally right at the
no,
beginning.
but the thing is that his Jewish origins, his real name was Herschel Steinschneider. It wasn't it didn't take any real effort to discover that. And in fact, the communists in Berlin in this period who hated him because they thought that Hannesen was becoming a kind of propaganda outlet for the Nazis, published all these details about his Jewish origins in their papers. So it was freely available. It seemed for a long time to make no particular difference to his Nazi friends. They did. So the argument that Hannesen was killed because they suddenly figured out that this man that they had introduced to the Fuhrer was a Jew doesn't really hold water, because they knew that when they introduced him to the Fuhrer. Now, keep in mind that all of this is going on with Hannesen, that Hannesen actually meets Hitler. Hannesen is a kind of stage occultist who claims the ability to see the future and to read the stars and to read minds, and that cultivates it. Crowley, in this case, is an observer of both of these things. I have to believe that Crowley was in at least one of... Crowley was sort of fascinated with stage magicians and mediums. He detested them, particularly mediums, but he was fascinated by stage magicians because of the tricks that they used. And by the way, he supposedly was quite good with stage magic as well, so he could sort of evaluate what they were doing. So Crowley would not have missed a Hannesen performance, or he would have caught that, and he had to be aware, since this was discussed in the German press, that Hannesen and Hitler were introduced to each other. That's where I think that in this sort of grist mill of history, that things that Hannesen actually did then somehow get connected to Crowley. So, did Crowley ever actually meet Hitler? Not as I can tell. Was he there at a time when someone, in some ways like him, Hannesen, did meet Hitler? Yes. And that's where I think these things, how that combines.
And that would make sense, because today, most people would know the name Aleister Crowley. I don't want to say most, because there's still a lot of people that don't, but a lot more people would know that, the name Crowley, than Hannesen. Nonetheless, we have several questions that have come, but I have to pick what's most relevant to what we're talking about. So first, I'm going to go back across the Atlantic pond because of the time they're in. So let me give it to Johnny first.
Okay, well, Luke in Clifton, Bristol, England asks, when researching the Nazis, did you research anything on the German Martin Bormann? And
no, I have not looked into Martin Bormann. No, there's the big question about Bormann is whether he died in Berlin at the end of the war in 1945, or as Ladislas Farrago said in his book, that he escaped off to sort of live happily ever after or miserably ever after in South America. I think that's still kind of an open question.
Okay, and another question I've got for myself is a question I wanted to ask you. Jack Parsons of JPL, who worked on the solid fuel systems rockets, was he not a member also of Aleister Crowley's OTO?
Yes, he was, and he corresponded with him. Jack Parsons joined the OTO. Had he lived, had he not blown himself up, or whatever it was that happened to him, I think in 53, he might well have gone on to head the organization. But yes, there is most definitely a real connection between Jack Parsons and the JPL and Aleister Crowley.
Okay, now let me get to this. Is a very I'm surprised this question wasn't brought up last time, and I was actually going to bring this up, but somebody brought it up, so might as well. Okay, Arthur Kent, right here in Glendale, California. Is Barbara Bush Aleister Crowley's daughter, as so many say?
Okay, not that question. I'm kind of glad that came up.
So am I, actually.
And it's interesting because some years ago, on another radio show like this, someone called in with that question, and I had never heard it before, and it was like, what? I had no idea.
Coast to Coast AM, right?
It was Coast to AM, and I had no idea what they were talking about. So I decided I would figure that out. Okay, here's another one. It's a story which has been around. I think the story actually goes back to about 2006. It appeared on someone's blog, and I think the key to the whole thing is the date in which the story appeared, which is the 1st of April 2006. Prior to the 1st of April 2006, I can find no one who mentions this. Now, okay, so was it just a big April Fool's prank? Well, maybe, but, sometimes real things happen on April Fools. So, it's again one of those things that is a longer story than it should be, so how shall I make it short? Again, let me look at it this way. If you look at Barbara Bush's mother, if you're looking, she was married to, she was Barbara Pierce, who was married to, right. And the question is that she was in Paris at this time, and she was hanging out with Aleister Crowley and his friend Frank Harris and his girlfriend. She was originally Pauline Robinson. There we go. And no, there's no record of her traveling outside of the country until the late 1920s. There's no record of her holding a passport, which she wouldn't necessarily have to have. There's no immigration record that should exist if she came in and out of the country. She was a married woman with a small child, and there's no evidence that she was in Paris at the time. Now, keep in mind, if she was in Paris at the time, a city of about 2 million people at that period, and she became pregnant. Also, the timing of the pregnancy doesn't work. That by the time this is supposed to have occurred, she was already back. Barbara Bush was, Marvin Pierce's daughter. And actually, if you look at him and her, people argue that Barbara Bush looks like Aleister Crowley, and that's because they kind of both look like, if you take their hair off, babies. Okay. But actually, if you look at Barbara Bush's father and her, there is a very strong resemblance between the two. So the timing doesn't work. There's no record of her being there. And I think you've also got another one of these cases of kind of confused identity, because in this period, Crowley had a number of women he was consorting with, but this is where I think it comes in, one of these Scarlet Women that he in fact takes up with just about this time, in September 1924. The woman he was canoodling, rather than Barbara Bush's mother, was an American woman from Chicago by the name of Dorothy Olson. And she also was married, and she was an alcoholic, and she was traveling in Europe looking for love, and she found it in some strange places, one of which was Aleister Crowley. And they were an item for a while, and eventually she went back to Chicago and her husband and went on with her life. But Dorothy Olson, the idea that if someone said that Aleister Crowley was, having an affair with a wealthy American woman from the Midwest, but it's Dorothy Olson. It's not Barbara Bush's mother. So I think that was some basis for the story. Now, I think it's a great story, and by the way, I'm not trying to debunk this because if you think that the Bushes are evil, they're no more or less evil, because, do you really need that? Okay, does that explain everything? Because no, I think it was pretty much somebody's idea of a joke. I think there was some things you could cobble together to make it work, but when you actually begin to break it down, which is one of the things in research you need to do, there's no there. There's one thing I would add, is that some people ask whether or not Aleister Crowley has any children. He probably has lots of them.
I know. I was going to ask you that.
Yeah.
With all these women, how many Crowleys are running around?
Oh, I'm not sure anybody. Most of them were, shall we say, illegitimate.
Yes.
I can give an interesting detail if anybody's interested. This was one that kind of surprised me. There was a woman who died, I think, in the Bay Area in California in 2014, and the name she died under was her married name, Louise Mueller, Muhler. And it turns out that Louise Mueller, you can actually read this in her obituary, it's in there, was born Astarte Shumway. And Astarte Shumway was Aleister Crowley's daughter by one of his many Scarlet women, Ninette Shumway. I think she was born in 1920, and sure enough, looked in, Ninette Shumway did become pregnant. She gave birth to a female child. Ninette sort of fades out of the picture. The child fades out. What eventually happened is the child was entrusted to Ninette's sister back in the States, and she was raised and changed her name and married a guy named Mueller, and seems to have been a perfectly ordinary woman with a family and a husband in the Bay Area. She knew who her father was. And by the way, there was a picture of her accompanying the obituary, and yep, she's Aleister Crowley's kid, that's for sure.
That's amazing. It's just amazing to know that, ended up here, and that's not obviously, he didn't die in the U.S., he died in the UK, right?
Right.
And then he was trying to finish the tarot deck with Lady, maybe you could help me there, what was her name?
Oh, was her name Harris as well, or am I thinking of somebody else?
Nah, nonetheless, she was somebody he spent 5 years with, I know that, to work or to paint all this tarot deck, but nonetheless, Lady Frida Harris, maybe was that it? I don't know.
I don't know.
It's okay. So here's an interesting question. Now, obviously, anybody traveling to and from Berlin and London and during World
This is George Tsoukalos, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
On both sides. And I would think that even though Aleister Crowley may have been approached by MI6 in the UK side and German intelligence, in Berlin from Royce going back to pre-World War I, again, the other side would still create sort of a fuss. So what did he do? Take direct flights there, or take a boat across? I mean, how did he get there?
Well, you take a boat across the channel, and you get on a train in Rotterdam, and you get off in Berlin.
Interesting.
That's the main way that you would do it at the time. I have my dog barking in the next room.
That's
by the
okay.
Way, so.
It's all right.
Okay.
He's part of the show.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so I mean, but the question is that did anybody notice? Yeah, they noticed because they actually put him up to it. His appearance in Berlin in this period, beginning like 29 and 30, was at the instigation. This is again something that it's in the book, and it's something. There is a British intelligence at this point Scotland Yard officer by the name of JFC Carter. And Carter was also something else. He was connected to Scotland Yard, but he was also Scotland Yard's liaison to MI6, or as we all know, actually the SIS. And so he sort of had a foot in both camps, so he's very interested in these operations. And one of the things that Carter was interested in, as any sort of British security officer would have been at that time, was, again, the presence of IRA people in Berlin. Okay, so keep in mind, 29 and 30, this is still Weimar Berlin. It's kind of the cool place to be, and it's happening, but it's also a fairly open country. And there were, the IRA had its tentacles there as well. So he was quite interested in what was going on there. And what happened in 29 is that Crowley, for some years, had been living in France. In fact, he'd been living in France, I think, since about 1924, when he showed up and took up with Dorothy Olson. And he was living there as a foreigner. but he had a card, which allowed, you were a resident alien, is what we would call it. And I think in the spring of 1929, the French government very abruptly pulled his resident alien card and told him he had to leave the country. And they had a reason as to why he had to leave the country. Guess what that was?
Huh.
Spying.
Spying.
Okay?
Go figure. I was just
okay.
going to think he was that, or it couldn't have been in the occult, because that's
he was suspected of, and the thing that he was suspected of. This mostly comes out of the French press. The French government is very mum about it, but the French press wasn't. Is that he was suspected? No, not of being a British spy. He was a German spy.
German spy. Huh.
So he's kicked out of France. All right. He hasn't been back to England for years. I mean, I'm not even sure he had been there since 1919. He'd lived in Italy. There might have been a few very forced, but it was one of the things he'd sort of stayed away from home, and part of it was because anytime he showed up, the British tabloid press went nuts, and Aleister Crowley is here. Hide your wives and daughters and don't let babies in the street.
And all that.
Right. And that drew sort of attention, and his friends in high places didn't want that kind of attention being brought to them. And I think the reason they didn't is that if you began to shine too much of a light on him, they might suddenly get caught up in it. But he's out, and he goes into Belgium, which was one of the few places you could sort of go to that hang around for a while. And then he's summoned back to London, and he meets with Carter. And Carter basically tells him is that, well, we can patch things up, but eventually what I would like you to do is I would like you to go to Berlin, and there I want you to check up on certain people. I want you, and particularly ones who are connected with the IRA. Now, this is one of the few things when you actually tend to look and what are the sort of documents that survive. What are the only kind of reports, so far as I know, that Crowley sent back? I mean, the type of things that are not supposed to become part of the historical record. And this, again, is something I have to notice. Operational intelligence reports, for the most part, are never intended to become part of the historical record. If they do, it's usually through oversight or through planning or through accident, but these are things that you're not supposed to openly, because there are names of people in there, and that's something you never want to be made public.
Yeah, I would think so.
And, I mean, there's a kind of contract which any sort of agency makes with the people who work for it. And that is, you never talk about what you did for us, and we never talk about you. And as long as you keep your end of the bargain, we keep our end of the bargain. And that's something which Crowley, through, he kind of pushed the envelope on, but that's one of the things that he did. Early non-disclosure, essentially. Right, you don't talk about it, because if you talk about it, then any of the sort of, the protection is gone.
Yes.
But one thing is that he did send reports back to Carter about some of the people that he was spying on there. And that wasn't certainly when he began that, but that's essentially what Carter, but that was eventually his ticket to come home. So one of the things to notice is that he spends, he's exiled in France, he comes out of it, he's brought in from the cold by Carter. Carter gives him another assignment in Berlin. And when that is completed, Aleister Crowley comes home. And in the 30s, he will come back to England, he will live there, and he will die there. He will do that, by the way, from 1934 on as an undischarged bankrupt. Technically, he has no income and resources after the mid-30s.
Really?
Yet the thing to notice is that he always has a roof over his head, he always has food, he has clothes. He doesn't live opulently,
money
but he lives
for
fairly
opium
well.
and other stuff that he was using.
Right, a Harley Street chemist, sent him a little packet of. He was listed as a hopeless addict, and he got his little, he got his junk every week from the pharmacist.
Yeah.
So what else can you ask for? So the question is, how exactly does that work?
Yeah.
And the way that it works is that's part of the protection that you get. I mean, that's kind of the payoff. And there's no way that you can really explain what happens to him, other than that there were people who were looking out for him, and who those people were, they weren't just Carter and others. But when Carter sent him off to Berlin. Now, was the whole purpose of that simply to spy upon a couple of sort of mid and low-level IRA people, or was there something else to that mission? Was Crowley sent there to contact Hannesen? Now, here again, now keep in mind, this is speculation. So I've taken the dots that I know exist, I'm going beyond them. Hanussen, we know, was an important figure in Berlin in this period who became quite, with occult overtones, someone that Crowley could communicate with, someone who was on the same wavelength as him, but who really was in connection with the Nazi elite, who hobnobbed with the chief of the brown shirts of the SA in Berlin, who was introduced to Hitler, who became he was called, there's a whole book called, Hitler's Jewish Psychic and, the Prophet of the Third Reich. These are the names that were attached to Hanussen. Now, you got to imagine that Hanussen was a clever and unscrupulous man. Here's something else that Hanussen did. He had a private yacht, and he had parties on that yacht. And, people vied to get invitations to those parties. And those parties involved things like orgies. And guess what Hanussen did while all this was going on? He filmed it.
Ooh.
He invited his guests to his yacht. They took their clothes off and did things that you would otherwise not speak about.
Of course, yeah.
And he filmed it. Now, therefore, some people argue that one of the things that Hanussen had going, part of his access to high society, was a tremendous blind, but he knew lots of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, if you were in British intelligence, French intelligence, whatever, and you really, and keep in mind, you've got this guy Hitler and his whole Nazi entourage, and it looks like these guys are going to take over the most powerful country in Europe, or that they might. Wouldn't you be curious to know everything about them that you could? Every detail, every single detail about everything that they thought or believed, what it was that they smoked, what it was that they ate, who it was they had to say, all of this stuff.
Of course.
And the person who could tell you that was Hanussen. And then what you would need is someone who could access Hanussen, and my argument would be who had the background, the expertise, the moral flexibility to approach Hanussen any better than Aleister Crowley.
Crowley,
that
that's
I wonder
the
is
only
what
person I would say, because
is what he was really doing there.
Yeah, that would make perfect sense. Now, we have one sort of unrelated question, but it's related to Crowley, and I'm going to make this the last question from the audience, since I want you to be able to finish the story before we run out of time. But Johnny, go ahead.
Again, another Facebook question from Robert in Edinburgh, and he puts it to Richard. People speak of Aleister Crowley as the wickedest man in the world, but you speak of him quite highly. But he was really a devil worshipper, or just a misunderstood eccentric, and was Lamb in the drawings of Crowley, the alien with the big head, really a demon or an alien?
What was it? I guess to start with the last, was it a demon or an alien? How would you know?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Right. Or a hallucination.
I think, as I've said before, when it comes to Aleister Crowley and his reputed occult powers, I am an agnostic. All right? I'm not contemptuously dismissive. I am quite skeptical about it. I don't know whether people have powers like that or not. And that's not the way that I'm looking at it. I'm not a follower of his. I'm not, a member of the OTO. That's, it's a real disclaimer. Nothing in that way. So I've always tried to look at him as objectively as possible.
And you have, especially in the book, Secret Agent 666.
And I've tried not to, whether or not he could conjure demons really wasn't what it was that I was concerned. The idea of being the wickedest man in the world and a devil worshiper, if you sort of go back to the wickedest man in the world, that again is one of these terms that's coined in the tabloid press. And initially when that comes up, I think in like 1920, 21, he sort of embraces it because it was, Crowley is... I guess to go back to maybe something we talked about before, an essential thing to understand about him is that he was raised in a strictly fundamentalist Christian household.
That's right. Quaker father, right?
Yeah, well, they were the Plymouth Brethren, which was one of those small groups that basically believed that they had the ticket to heaven and everybody else was going to hell. And he was very close to his father, who died when he was young, and he seems to have idolized. But his father was basically a Christian lay preacher, a man who had money, but who spent his time proclaiming the kind of, end-time gospels. And Crowley seems to have had a rather more complicated relationship with his mother, and it was his mother, at least according to him, that first called him the Beast. And he kind of liked that. And I think, one of the ways you can look at it is that he was, beginning as a boy and then as a man, I think he started out doing things that horrified his mother. And then it was something that horrified other people. I've known people like that. People who will deliberately embrace very provocative, horrifying things because it shocks people, and it gives them a sense of identity and power. And I think that's not the only explanation for him, but it is part of what was going on there. I mean, he deliberately embraced that kind of identity. But the thing that happened, and this is certainly true by the time you get to the latter part of his life, in the 30s, once he returns to England, one of the things he does, if you go back to the press in that period, is that he really tries to try to redress that. He realized that he had become, in the public eye, so vilified. He had become such a kind of cartoon figure of evil that really no one would take him seriously as anything else. And his effort to try to redeem his reputation, I think, fundamentally failed because for some reason people preferred to believe the other one because it was more interesting. Was he a devil worshiper? Was he a Satanist? People can sort of line up the quotes one way or the other. Personally, I don't think so. I'm not sure that he wouldn't have tried it. And I'm not saying that to try to redeem his reputation. Crowley was, and again, trying to look at it just exactly, was in many ways a very brilliant man. He was also an extraordinarily flawed one, as all people were.
And a spoiled brat.
And a spoiled. He had no sense of money. He would squander money. He would be horrible as a business. I mean, really. And keep in mind, he inherited a large amount of money, and he blew all of it. I mean, he was poor. He was bankrupt in the 1930s because he was financially incompetent. Mm. He also was extraordinarily abusive and cruel to people around him. The women that he was involved with, almost all of those things ended badly. He, in the end, had very few friends because, very few people could put up with him. He wasn't a misunderstood genius. He was a man who deliberately went out of his way to be misunderstood, and then could never really come back from it. For all of that, though, I'd say that I ended up having, I'll admit, a certain degree of sympathy for him. I think he was a person who's become that there is more to him than this kind of boogeyman. There are two ways. He either becomes this kind of saint, and there are people who regard him as a great spiritual leader, and there are others, a much larger number of people, who regard him as sort of, again, the arch-Satanist of the 20th century.
And
remember, in between them...
in the UK, he was ranked, I think in the year 2000, number 70-something in the top 100 the most influential British people of all time. He was in that ranking.
He's up there. So he's, in fact, of all of the people I've worked on, I mentioned Boris Savinkov, and people, who's that? Sidney Riley, some people know who that is. Aleister Crowley. I think I mentioned in the book that there's the old game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Well, you can easily do 6 Degrees of Aleister Crowley, and he's connected that way to virtually everybody. It was amazing the number of people that he knew. It sort of comes back to the earlier question: did he consort with the royal family? Well, I don't think it's impossible, but again, it's not something that they probably would have talked about openly, because he was simply too controversial of a figure to do that with. But he was, he never capitalized upon his fame. He never really made any money off of it. And in his church and the OTO and the things he tried to found, they survived. But let's face it, they didn't supplant Christianity or anything else. It didn't quite work out the way that he had planned. So to me, in a way, there is the element of a tragic figure. And the definition of a tragic figure isn't just someone who bad things happen to, but who kind of brings bad things upon them. Maybe he sort of ventured into things that he shouldn't have. Maybe there is indeed a spiritual price to be paid for that. But I guess that's the way that I see him.
Now, unfortunately, we're really close on the end of time, so I'm going to ask you this final question, and then I have a couple other things I want to get out real quick. So basically, I'm going to put it to you this way, because we definitely have to continue this. I want to know more about Crowley and his roles in World War I and World War II, as does the audience. And we definitely have to talk about Sidney Riley next time. That's for sure. Trust no one is going to be our starting point next time. So, let me sum it to you this way. Is there any major findings that you've had that Crowley did any spying that altered the wars, both World War I and World War II, for better or for worse?
The one thing that in his diary, he one of the things he kept, they're often very cryptic, was an almost day-by-day diary.
Yes.
And I think it's in January or February 1917. He's in New Orleans at that point, sniffing ether. But he's still keeping his favorite drug of choice, by the way.
I didn't know that. I thought it was opium.
Yeah.
They're all over the place.
But one of the things that has happened is that it occurs just as the United States breaks diplomatic relations with Germany. Now that happened. They declare war in April, but I think it's back in February that the Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and that sort of pushed the Wilson administration over the edge, and they break diplomatic relations. And when he hears that, he makes this note. Now, keep in mind, he's basically making this note to himself: is that my work has sort of completed. This certainly will bringing that the United States will come into the war, and that's the thing that I've been working for, and that this has now been achieved. And he's sort of patting himself in the back on that. Now, how much did he actually have to do with that? Well, here's what he thought he had to do with it, whether or not it's true. Crowley, in working as a German propagandist, that is, working as a British agent pretending to be a German propagandist, again, wrote scathingly anti-British, anti-Allied articles for Viereck's Fatherland. And he also argued that in private settings, one of the things that he would tell the Germans is that, look, you want to keep the Americans neutral. Germany doesn't want the U.S. to come into the war. And by the way, the British wanted the U.S. to come into the war. And there I can tell you that it wasn't just Crowley, but the head of British intelligence in New York, another guy worked on, Sir William Wiseman, that was his number one job, to bring the U.S. into the war any way he could, and that succeeded. Now, Crowley may have been a small part of that. How Crowley thought he assisted it is that he convinced the Germans that the way to keep the Americans out of the war was to scare them and to horrify them. He said the Americans are inexperienced, they're like children, so you have to frighten them. Therefore, rather than trying to use reason with them, you have to use Schrecklichkeit. Okay, and this is why something like sinking the Lusitania, which he applauded, by the way, that's something that will sort of, frighten these yellow Yankees, and it will make them think twice about getting into the war. Now, he later argued that this was very successful because he thought he had steered the Germans into a path that neutralized their actual propaganda and worked to create a more hostile environment among the Americans as opposed to one that was more amenable to Germany. And that's how he later argued he had contributed to bringing the U.S. into the war. Now, while I think that probably would have happened without him one way or the other, he played his small part, and he was part of it. He was part of a large operation to bring the United States into the war, and that succeeded.
And that makes perfect sense because the UK wanted the U.S. to come help them. I mean, especially during World War II, when the U.S. did not want to join the war, what did we do? We literally, as far as us, because this is an international audience, I got to say, right, the Americans were supplying the English with arms as best as they could until war was declared upon America from both Japan and then ultimately Germany, and then, of course, thrusting the U.S. in there. Richard, it's been a truly amazing time. We have to do this again. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So let me tell you this before we go, and mind you, please stay on till afterwards. If you have one final statement before we get to your promotions on anything you've said today, if you have just one thing to say to everybody out there, remember this is an international audience, what would you say with regards to what within the confounds of what we've spoken to just about tonight?
I'd say that much of real history, most of the things that have happened, have never been recorded, and in everything, even in the things you know, even in the things that you were convinced you know, there is always another story underneath. There is always more to learn, and one little thing can change your entire perception of an historical event. Never ignore the details.
The devil is in the details. I
He is
agree
indeed.
with that in every aspect, and the fact that, the stories that we're told, don't take them, as the full truth. Take them as a grain of salt, because there are so many other stories that could, first of all, that could be propaganda that you're just hearing, the story of the outcome that best fits what situation you're in, and furthermore, what you also said, things that are not written for the most part are usually the most secret stuff. That's just the way to go, so you don't leave a paper trail. Anyhow, it's been an outstanding time with Dr. Richard Spence. Now, Richard, let's talk about your books again. As I said, everybody can already get them from clicking on our website on Books and Videos tab on drjradiolive.com. But tell us about them, and of course, your new project.
Okay, once again, Secret Agent 666, the main topic for tonight, is available on Amazon and whoever else sells books. There should be plenty of copies there. Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, which is really about more than just Sidney Riley, but focuses on him. I think there should, there certainly would be used copies available there, so I wouldn't give up on that. And again, also on Amazon, Empire of the Wheel, which I co-authored with Walter Bosley, is available there. Again, the current project, the thing that is consuming my life, which I'm not working on right now because I'm doing this, is Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, which is, I think, a much different look at what happened in Russia and its connections, especially with the United States, but not exclusively, between the turn of the 20th century and the mid-1920s, the fall of the Tsarist regime and the rise of the communist one.
I hope you let me know when that's ready so we could talk about that, because, we're going to have you back to talk about Trust No One and again about Secret Agent 666.
And let me add one more thing. That book will be published by Trine Day Press. I'm sure they would want me to mention that.
Oh, yeah, they're fantastic people. They actually published Paul Hellier's book. Yes, Trine Day is a great company out there. So everybody, check out their website. They have an amazing catalog of books. Nonetheless, I want to first thank, of course, Dr. Richard Spence for joining us again tonight, a University of Idaho professor, and of course, we both have something in common, that we both studied at University of California, Santa Barbara, me for my undergrad degree before I went down to law school, and him for his graduate degree. So I thought that was really cool. Nice little intersection in this little small world we live in. Before I want to thank our crew, let's give thanks to our affiliates. We have Ira Robinson and Michael Vara from Late Night in the Midlands for carrying our show, along with Angel Espino of PSN Radio, and where Johnny Webb is in the United Kingdom, JC of Deprogram Radio for carrying the show. Of course, all the terrestrial stations, we also thank you as well. Not to mention all you internet listeners, the new age, as I like to say, the millennials. Thank you, of course, and you could always catch the archives of this show once they make their rounds on our YouTube channel. All you have to do is remember the phrase, which is the same name as the show, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. The same name for Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, Google+, Gmail, Slack, Pinterest, whatever you think, whatever email or whatever account you could think of social media-wise, that is there. Also, a word from our sponsors. Don't forget the Watchers package, Watchers 10 package. You receive the Watchers 10 DVD, Watchers 7. You also receive his Elia Marzulli's book on Nephilim, and of course a year subscription to PPS. I think it's Paranormal Prophecy, Supernatural, and Zox Pro. Learn how to unlock your memory and photographic memory. Remember, as I stated before, and as we interviewed 14 times, the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who sadly passed away this year, in February who was a spokesperson for them. And before I took upon them coming on to our show and endorsing us, I had to check in with him. I said, hey, tell me, off the record, is this for real? And he said yes. And well, that was enough for me. So all you have to do is mention Dr. J when checking that there. And there's so many more. I just don't have enough time. Everybody just check it out on the website. It's drjradiolive.com. Of course, I want to thank my team. I'm going to start from east to west. We got Johnny Webb in London. Thank you for staying up so late, of course, and watching all the social media, accounts for the questions. Then we have Tom Schaefer in Miami. Miami Tom, doing some sound engineering and production throughout the show. Of course, we also have here where I'm located, SoCal Dan for the chat and researching. We have Lucian, who was the one who asked for the file number, which we will get to everybody out there for what you heard at the beginning of the show. The final people I want to thank are you, the listeners, global, young, old, middle-aged, women, men, black, white, whatever you are, anywhere you are. We thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Again, you could always join us Monday through Friday. The live show's Tuesday through Thursday. And don't forget, we are on several different times in the different networks, but on this live show, it is 7 p.m. Pacific time, 10 p.m. Eastern time, and 3 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Wherever you